Hey legends, and welcome back to the least knowledgeable sim racing channel. It's fair to say that over the last few years, the racing sim which has seen the greatest overhaul and improvement is ironically the same one which was abandoned by its developer. Assetto Corsa, through the grace of its modding community, has become one of the largest and most budding racing simulators around. You can take just about any kind of racing and know that AC has you covered in some way, shape, or form. It's truly the embodiment of the value of open platforms and how many years of enjoyment they can create. In fact, since the release of Soul and Custom Shaders patch and the expansion of its physics engine which followed, some people have even questioned what the point of having Kunos create the more specialized sequel Assetto Corsa Competizione even was. Their proposition is that, in its current state, the prequel is actually a better all-round simulator. So, since we're here on a sim racing channel which grew based on comparing one sim to another, why don't we put that to the test? Due to, once again, the grace of the AC modding community, we now have the same laser scan version of Suzuka in AC as we have in ACC. So we're going to take this track and compare a car which has become synonymous with this channel, the Ferrari 488 GT3. All of this content, of course, comes packed into ACC officially, but has either been created from scratch or to some degree ported over into AC. As mentioned, the track, for the purposes of driving, should be more or less identical between titles. The 488 in AC has been created by BK Studio, recently had its physics overhauled, and uses the CSP extensions to make the car behavior more lifelike in a way that the stock developer content simply wasn't able to. So, with the same car and track in hand, let's delve in and see whether ACC was an unnecessary sidestep. Before we do, however, consider clicking that sub to stay notified of more fun and marginally educational sim racing comparisons in the future. Starting out in AC, after giving the car a quick tune to more closely approximate the setup in ACC, the first thing you notice is that there is way more going on with this car than any of the stock GT3 content. In fact, it barely even feels like the same experience. The car feels more grounded, weighty, and less prone to strange SimCady pendulum slides. There's simply more happening, more information being transferred to you, and more non-linear behaviors being exhibited by the car. As we get to the famed Suzuka S's, the first of our red flags begin to pop up. See, unlike ACC, AC currently, even with its expanded physics, is still hamstrung by a simplified single-point time model. Why do I point this out now? Well, because you're about to see exactly why this is a problem as we ride an inside curb. AC is still prone to exhibiting the dreaded curb black hole suction effect, as if they generate their own gravity. This is a phenomena well known to anybody that's sunk hours into project cars too. This is simply not how cars behave over curbs under most circumstances, which is more closely reflected by ACC. Jumping over to the same section in Assetto Corsa Competizione, we immediately see and hear that it's quite frankly just superior in its audio-visual presentation. Despite the idiosyncrasies of using Unreal Engine 4 for a racing simulator, the net effect is still a deeper and more detailed visual scape. The sounds are no comparison. ACC is an industry leader in this area. If you take the steps in physics complexity from the stock GT3 content in AC to the modded-in CSP-powered 488, imagine taking that same magnitude of step yet again, and you now have the ACC 488. The car is yet again more weighty and connected to the driver. You can immediately see that my lines are cleaner as I maintain greater control while both trail braking and coasting. I'm also able to ride the inside curves on the S's in order to help pull in and rotate the car without spinning, just as one might do in real life. There's been a big debate as to whether AC or ACC are inherently easier to drive than one another. From my perspective, it simply depends on what you're used to and what you're expecting. For me, anything that behaves more like a real car is easier to drive intuitively, because driving is what I'm attempting to emulate with this hobby. AC is certainly simpler in its driving model, and if you practice with it and learn its ins and outs, you can recover from some pretty crazy situations. If you want to know what I mean, load up a Group C car and see the sorts of slip angle corrections it'll allow you to get away with. ACC is more uncompromising, but it also feels more grounded in reality. So if you know how a car is likely to behave in a given situation, you can more easily anticipate what you'll need to do. Going back to AC, flying over an inside curb at high speed tells us that this persistent curb behavior is quite a problem. It consistently leads to some emergently unrealistic behaviors from an otherwise relatively grounded automobile. This is why ACC desperately needed its 5-point time model update in order to push forward in its simulation quality. Those of us who were with ACC since the early days likely remember how little the cars actually drove like real-life automobiles, and how taking any curb was like playing a game of Russian roulette. AC still exhibits those behaviors even with its updates, and it takes away greatly from the immersion. It creates an air of trepidation where you're afraid to push over curbs and try to get those extra few tenths. Not the disincentive structure you want to create in a simulator. In ACC, we're finally at a point where we can push on the limit and make adjustments and corrections for slip. It's not perfect, however, as the cars are still prone to this strange, nebulous mid-speed corner slip, which results in the driver just aimlessly seesawing the wheel until the simulator decides to engage traction again. It's not snappy and responsive as one would see in the real-life automobiles. This is one of the few last major physics omissions hanging over the title. Some have suggested that it's because Unreal Engine 4 can't simulate weight transfer properly, others have suggested it's because it can't render suspension behaviors properly. Whatever the case, the sensation of weight transfer is still better rendered in AC, rFactor 2 and especially Beam and G. The electronic systems such as TC and ABS feel far better rendered in ACC, creating a more progressive feeling based on how they're set. They interfere less with your driving and rather just complement it, assuming they're set correctly. In AC, it still somewhat feels like trying to pin the tail on the donkey. It has to be said that some of the newer modded cars in AC look astounding. Both the interior and exterior of this 488 are phenomenal, with a fully rendered heads-up display. In some ways, I prefer the visual rendering of cars in AC to ACC. With the new shaders, under the right circumstances, they can create some astonishing photos. These are usually let down by sparsely detailed track models, however. At the end of the day, the advances made by the modding community for AC are truly impressive. Compared to how the stock game looks and handles, the aftermarket content is something else entirely. But when we compare it to AC's true sequel, we can see that the core physics framework has been outgrown. ACC not only looks and sounds better, but also has a deeper well of physics, creating a more engaging driver experience when comparing identical content. That said, there are some areas where AC is pushing ahead, such as the insane graphical fidelity of its wet weather effects, or just weather and shader effects in general. Not to mention a far wider variety of cars and tracks than ACC has on offer. Having paid attention to the recent chatter over at Kunos, it seems like they're entertaining the idea of going back to a proprietary in-house engine for Assetto Corsa 2. That sounds like a potential best-case scenario for both the developers and the fans. No longer hindered by the arbitrary limitations of Unreal Engine 4 and powered by a bespoke, custom engine which builds on the physics framework of both AC and ACC, we may one day emerge with a game that combines the best of both worlds. Until then, it's very fair to say that Assetto Corsa Competizione, while not being the true sequel that many fans of the original were looking for, is a significant step up and evolution on the original all the same. Until next time, we'll see you later.